Welcome to the fourth lecture of the Śākta traditions lecture series. This is the third lecture given by Professor Sanderson, and it will also be the final lecture that he will give this term. The lecture turned out to be a bit longer than expected, so I suggest you break it up in smaller pieces while watching it. Professor Sanderson has also provided a new and wonderful handout for this lecture, and it can be downloaded from the Śākta traditions website like the previous handout. I've also put a link to it down in the description of this video. I hope you all enjoy the lecture.
Today I come to the third of my three lectures on the Śākta traditions. The first two were concerned with Shaivism in general. I tried to map out a picture of the whole of the Shiva religion and concentrating towards the end on the non-Siddhantika traditions within which the Shakta tendencies are found. And then in the second half of that first lecture, or rather the second lecture effectively, I looked at the situation in Kashmir in greater detail, emphasizing the need to discard the notion of a Kashmir Shaivism, or showing the inadequacy of that label, misleading nature of that label. And also from that leading into the position, which I hold quite strongly, that these traditions cannot be studied in isolation from other aspects of the Shiva religion. Although they are distinct in many respects, and some traditions within them are more, turn their back more firmly on mainstream Shiva traditions, we nonetheless need to see them all from the point of view of those engaging with them from the outside, particularly royal patrons. We need to see them as forming a complex interacting system which serves a variety of needs, religious and emotional, for those who invest in them. Now, having given you this outline of the Shakta Shiva traditions in Kashmir towards the end of my second lecture, and having made the point there, which I have made in print on other occasions, that the assumption that the Trika is the most important or the emblematic tradition of Kashmir, having shown that that assumption is actually wrong, that there isn't a huge amount of evidence that the Trika was very widespread in the Shiva community, there's much more evidence that the Kali Kula, the cult of Kali, especially in its Krama or Maharata manifestations, was actually a much more vigorous and lively tradition in Kashmir. And we can see the effect of this reality from Abhinavagupta's work on the Trika, because in that work, he's constantly trying to embed Krama notions inside Trika categories in such a way that he can, as it were, apply a filter by virtue of which Trika realities can be read as Krama realities. I think I also pointed out last week that I reached the conclusion that Abhinavagupta was trained first in the Krama as a young man, and then later moved into the study and interpretation of the Trika. So this fits the same picture, that he brought what he referred to as, in his early works, as the esoteric tradition, the Rahasyam Naya. He brought that with him and read it into the materials of the Trika, particularly the Malini Vidyottara, which, when read on its own, contains no connections with the Kali Kula. So there is a kind of hybridization going on there, but I don't want to claim that Abhinavagupta was the first to take these steps, because we have a work called the Devya Yamala, which is part of the scriptural tradition of the Trika, which already brings about that synthesis by claiming that the three goddesses on the lotuses on the tips of the trident, Para, Parappara, and Appara, are grounded in a fourth goddess worshipped above them, namely Kala Sankarshini, who is, as you know by now, the principal goddess of the Kali Kula. And in fact, I've shown in an early work that the Trika Sadbhava, another later text of this tradition, has incorporated the Krama in the very heart of its version of the mandala of the Trika by worshipping in the very center of the lotus the 12 Kalis, which form the culminating cycle in the meditative worship of the Krama. So there's a certain amount of syncretism already going on in Kashmir. And syncretism is something which we tend to overlook because the learned authors on the whole try to take our minds away from that insisting on the fact that, like castes, religious traditions may not mingle. Well, just as castes in reality mingled to a greater or lesser extent, so likewise religious traditions. And we have plenty of evidence in Gyanaratnavali, for example, in his commentary on Tantra Loka, that the Trika was by no means an unhybridized system. He notes, for example, that there were certain gurus who were teaching a hybrid of text A and text B, for example. We have a number of examples of that. So hybridization is already going on, in spite of the tendency of the learned to be purists in the way that one keeps castes apart in Orthodox Brahmanical thinking. Likewise, one should stick to one particular tantric tradition and not mingle it with others. Reality on the ground, as manifest in ritual manuals, etc., shows that in practice things were much more complicated and much more mixed up. Now, having last week dealt with in broad outline, with the nature and dynamics of Śākta Shaivism in Kashmir, I want now to look at, in this lecture, what we know about these traditions outside Kashmir. And this question, which is a large one, of course, has two aspects, makes us look in two directions. Firstly, we need to ask ourselves, to what extent are these, we'll start with the Trika here, to what extent is the Trika a Kashmirian production, and to what extent is it perhaps not? Does it perhaps have its origins elsewhere, and was introduced at some as yet unknown point into the valley of Kashmir? Like so many other things in the Kashmirian melting pot. It was, of course, a place which relied very much on the importing of Brahmins from other regions. Now, the answer to that question is a difficult one to give, but we can point out certainly that there are some elements in our Trika evidence that do point to Kashmir. I mentioned the Devyayamala as a text which teaches the embedding of the three goddesses of the Trika in the fourth goddess of the Kali Kula, Kala Samkarshli. That text very probably was redacted in Kashmir. You may wonder how I come to that conclusion, since scriptures are usually rather adept at concealing their origin. The reason I have here is because it has a peculiar version of the list of 8 countries beginning with the letter K or K, which are said in Shaiva tradition, widespread Shaiva tradition, to be places from which it is not a good idea to recruit acharyas. In fact, from which acharyas are excluded. That is to say, if you're looking for an acharya, do not take one from any of the 8 countries beginning with K, the Kakarashtaka, as it's called, the 8 Ks. And one of these in most lists is Kashmir. And the reasoning behind this is that the early Shaiva tradition is emphasizing the Brahmanical heartland of Aryavarta, the Madhya Desh, I should say, rather, or Antarvedi, even more exclusively, the Ganges, Yamuna, Doab as the ideal place, the place of traditional Brahmanical learning, etc. If you want a good acharya, look there. Well, of course, the Kashmiris cannot have been very pleased by this tradition, and the same would be the case in the far south, because in this list we sometimes find Kanchi and Kaveri, which of course were great centers of great centers of Shaiva tradition. So in the case of the Devyayamala, the list has been modified to eliminate Kashmir, and I think they introduced Karnataka in its place, if I remember correctly. So I think that's a fairly clear indication that this text was redacted in Kashmir, and that Kashmiris, as it were, I would say, cooked the books, because that's happening all the time in scriptural production, but nonetheless adjusted the tradition in a way that was less inconvenient for Kashmirian acharyas. So we do have one example, the Devyayamala, which looks as though it may well be a Kashmirian product. And the fact that it hybridizes the Trika and the Krama also points in that direction, since we do see that the Krama was so vigorous and so widespread in Kashmir during this period. But now I want to look at what other evidence there may be that the Trika came in to Kashmir from the outside. And I think there is some. It's not abundant, but I'm gradually unearthing this and that, which leads to the conclusion that this tradition, if it did not originate in the Deccan, on the Deccan Plateau, was certainly there at a date which is likely to be earlier than the earliest evidence for the Trika in Kashmir. So what is this evidence? And this is under your item 1 on your handout, the Kaula Trika, brackets Purvam Naya, the Eastern tradition in southern India. Just a comment on Purvam Naya, I should remind you that the Kaula traditions were widely classified in accordance with the cardinal directions, east, west, north, and south. And the Purvam Naya corresponds to the Kaula Trika. The Paschimam Naya followed it and imitated it to a large extent, but also innovated in certain fundamental respects. And it differentiated itself as the Paschimam Naya. Now, everyone at that time could see, presumably, that the Paschimam Naya was a development of the Purvam Naya. So the Paschimam Naya scriptures, particularly the Kula Ratnodyota, are particularly eager to disguise the chronological relationship and to insist, in fact, through prophecy within scripture, that the Purvam Naya will arise in later times as a mirror image of the Paschimam Naya. The historical reality is the other way around. The Paschimam Naya scriptures were, in their production, they depended heavily upon the pre-existing scriptures of the Trika. We don't have all those scriptures, but what we do have is sufficient to show this, that the Paschimam Naya was dependent on these texts. The very fact that it creates a myth of which inverts that relationship rather points towards the same fact, I would say. So on your handout, you have an excerpt from an earlier publication of mine in which I give the evidence, or some of the evidence at least, for the conclusion that the Paschimam Naya, which was built on the basis of the Trika, of the Purvam Naya, that the Paschimam Naya is a product of the Deccan, and also the Konkan region, the coastal strip which runs down from south of Bombay down to Karnataka. That this region of the Deccan is the place of origin of this tradition. It does seem very likely because the texts of the tradition assert it, and there are various features, for example, in the naming practices for the names of the goddesses ending in ava, which also strongly point in that direction. And after that citation, on page 2 of your handout, I've also provided some epigraphical evidence, evidence in inscriptions. In fact, one inscription here I've cited, for the presence of the Paschimam Naya in the Deccan. This inscription is dated in a date corresponding to, which would have fallen in 1029 AD. And this is clearly indicating a Paschimam Naya tradition there. I know that there is other epigraphic evidence which has not been published yet. Jason Swartz of Santa Barbara has been working on this for a good long time and has gathered quite a lot of information, which he has communicated to me verbally. I've heard him lecture about it, but it certainly points in the same direction, that there's quite a lot of references to the cult of the goddess Kubjika in inscriptions in the Deccan region. So that's the first evidence, that this doesn't prove that the Trika originated in the Deccan, but since the Paschimam Naya seems to have originated there and is drawing heavily upon the Trika, the scriptures of the Trika, it's quite likely, or rather I'd say necessary conclusion, that the scriptures of the Trika were available to these Kaulas in that region. I might add here the fact that the founder of the Kula system, the mythic founder of the Kula system in the present degenerate age, the Kali Yuga, is said in the Kaula Trika to be Machanda, also known as Meenanatha or Matsyendranatha, and that his consort is Konkanamba, a princess of Konkan, which of course is the coastal strip of the Deccan. So that and many other indications point towards that part of the world, I think, for the development of this pre-intellectualized tradition. This early Kaula tradition is not very sophisticated on an intellectual level. What we see in Kashmir is a huge transformation which occurs when these traditions were taken up by learned Brahmins who were existing in a pluralistic environment with lots of other traditions, and in order to establish themselves, they needed to produce a coherent account of themselves to answer such questions as why is ritual necessary, what is the purpose of transgressive ritual, and so forth. These early texts are not very rich in that kind of thinking. They're concerned with prescription rather than rationalization. So now, further evidence of the Trika in this region. We have an account of the Trika in a Champu Kavya, that's a poem in mixed verse and prose. The Yashastilaka, a wonderful work, huge encyclopedic, magisterial work, composed by the Jaina scholar and poet Somadeva Suri. It was written in the Deccan near Vemulavara in the modern state of Telangana in Shaka 881, which is AD 959 to 960. And this is considerably before evidence of Kashmirian influence on the Śākta Shaivism of this region. And this is what he says. I've given the Sanskrit in my handout, which will be available to you when you listen to this lecture, I believe. Perhaps it's not necessary for me to read it out. I'll just give you my translation. Now remember, this is by a Jain, hence the tone of contempt for the Kula Acharyas, the masters of the Kaula tradition. He writes, the vile Kula Acharyas maintain that liberation comes about from practice in which the mind is free of inhibition in such matters as the distinction between permitted and forbidden foods and drinks. For the Trika doctrine teaches that one should propitiate Ardhanarishvara at night. Ardhanarishvara is the form of Shiva in which he shares his body with the goddess. So they're fused with the goddess on the left, and his male part on the right. That one should propitiate Ardhanarisha at night with one's mouth full of the fragrance of alcoholic liquor, with one's heart tranquil from the taste of meat, adopting the Shakti seal, the Shakti mudra, and the yoga posture, with one's consort positioned beside one to the left, assuming thereby the likeness of Shiva in his Uma Maheshwara form. The Uma Maheshwara form is that which portrays Shiva and Uma, Maheshwara and Uma, as a loving couple in which the goddess is sitting on his left thigh and he has his arm around her, sometimes holding her face as well, holding her chin, at least in Eastern Indian representations. So this account leads to the hypothesis, prompts the hypothesis, that the form of the Trika known to Somadeva Suri is that known in the Tantra Sadbhava. And now I say this, I'm rather jumping ahead. Anyone who read that account of the Trika found in the Yashastilaka would say, but there's no evidence in any of our Trika texts, and not in Tantra Loka certainly, or Malini Vijayottara, that the deity was worshipped in the Ardhanarishvara form, this distinctive fusion of the two deities into one body. So perhaps he's making it up, he's heard of the Trika, but he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Well, in fact, it doesn't prove that, because there is a work, the Tantra Sadbhava, and this is a scripture that was heavily cannibalized by the Paschimam Naya in the production of the Kubjika Mata. And this does teach the Ardhanarishvara mode of worshipping the deity. The archetypal version of this in the Tantra Sadbhava is the fusion into one body of the two alphabet deities, the male Shabdarashi Bhairava, which is the Sanskrit alphabet in the normal order, beginning with the vowel A and ending with Ksha after Ha, making 50 elements. And the goddess side is the Malini order of the alphabet, beginning with Na and ending with Pa. But this model is also modified in certain kalpas, certain ritual procedures. So if you see on your handout, page 3, you'll see I've listed three instances of this Ardhanarishvara worship in the center, the very foreground of the Tantra Sadbhava. The first is the worship of the sun Bhairava, Martanda Bhairava, in the Uma Maheshwara Chakra Vidya, in the propitiation of a particularly long Vidya, which invokes Rudra and the mother goddesses. And in this, the central deity is Ardhanarishwara, consisting, as I've just said, of Shabdarashi Bhairava and Malini. Of course, there are deities around them, culminating in 24 yoginis, an outer circuit of 24 yoginis. Now, as you know, by now, the Trika involves the propitiation of these three goddesses, Para, Parappara, and Appara. They may be worshipped collectively in a Samudayiko Yagaha, or they may be worshipped individually or severally. You can do a sadhana for one or other, depending on the particular goal you're seeking. Now, the worship of Parappara, the intermediate goddess, also involves an Ardhanarishwara visualization, but in this case, the place of Malini is ceded to Parappara. So we have a fused deity of Shabdarashi Bhairava and Parappara. Para doesn't come into the picture because she has a non-iconic worship in this particular tantric tradition, that of the Tantra Sadbhava. As for Appara, the third goddess, she is worshipped in the Uma Maheshwara mode, a slightly less intimate situation in which she's sitting on his knee rather than fused into one body. And then finally, on my item 3, we have the idea that the Malini within the Ardhanarishwara, the female half of the Ardhanarishwara, is the proto-yogini, the original yogini, or the source of all yoginis. Now, what you need to know as a sort of a great generalization about the Kaula tradition is that while mainstream Shaivism has a cosmic hierarchy of Rudras, for the most part, male deities, the Shakta Kaula tradition has, as it were, a pantheon or indeed a cosmology of yoginis. So the yoginis are manifested as individual goddesses, as secondary goddesses in retinues, and ultimately manifesting in sacred places, in the persons of humans and others. Yoginis can appear all over the place in this particular view, particularly in low caste women, according to these traditions. Some of them are malevolent and dangerous, some of the benevolent, some are in between. And there are elaborate classifications of yoginis to be found in the Tantra Sadbhava, particularly in the Tantra Sadbhava. So this is the idea that Malini is, as it were, the archetype of all yoginis within this unified body. So I've given some translations there, so addition and translations. The supreme yogini, although she is one alone, becomes infinitely multiple, being present throughout the universe in many diverse transformations such as these. In giving these passages, I have not annotated the oddities in the Sanskrit. For example, the use of yogi meaning yogini. You will just have to excuse the language of scripture. If you are a scrupulous Sanskritist, you will wince at that usage. Eka eva para yogi, the one supreme yogi meaning yogini. Yeah. So in that passage we read, in reality there is just one supreme yogini. This is Malini, the exalted goddess who embodies all the speech sounds as the alphabet from na to pa. She is the ultimate power within the body of Maheshwara, occupying half of Bhairava's person. It is from her that there arise within the heart of Lord Bhairava those yoginis that reside on the trident and engage in cosmic play, causing all the emissions and retractions that constitute the cosmic process. There are other yoginis who are present everywhere as office holders, pervading the universe with their peaceful, fierce, and intermediate actions. Now, this issue of the Ardhanarishwara still, I've given you a passage here from another part of the text, which interestingly correlates the mode of intimacy of the male and female deities with the level of revelational practice. And we have an ascending hierarchy, which culminates in Ardhanarishwara. And here's the evidence. My devoted wife, this is of course Shiva speaking to the goddess, my devoted wife, it has been declared that on the level of instruction by yoginis, which is termed upadesha, or oral instruction, the deity should be visualized as a young girl on Bhairava's lap. On the level of instruction by yoginis termed sampradaya, or transmission, the deity should be visualized copulating. And on the Kula path, that is to say, on the Kaulika level, one should visualize them as Ardhanarishwara. And that's a rather striking passage. And prompts me to comment on one major difference between the Shakta Shaiva tradition in general and the very similar Buddhist Yogini Tantra tradition. Anyone who's familiar with the mainly Tibetan iconography that survives from this Buddhist Yogini Tantra tradition is struck by the fact that the deities are generally represented, male and female, in the act of copulation. Yet this seems not to be seen in iconographic descriptions of the very similar deities which we have in the esoteric, non-Siddhantika Shaiva Shakta, Shakta Shaiva domain. In fact, the reason is that it would seem to me to be that there's been a certain expurgation going on, and that in this passage here we see an earlier tradition which corresponds very closely to what we see in the Buddhist tradition, where indeed there is a hierarchy, according to the learned, whereby the deities express greater and greater intimacy as you climb up the hierarchy of different levels of tantric initiation. So they start off with a smile and a glance and then move to copulation, and that's the highest level. Nothing like Ardhanarishwara is mentioned in that context, but the idea of a progression in tantric worship from relatively anodyne representations of syzygies through to Ardhanarishwara, through to copulation is emphasized. Now, moving on, what other evidence do we have that might point to the Deccan as a still flourishing area of Shakta tradition in the time of Abhinavagupta, or in the generations immediately before him? Well, there is a verse which is quoted without attribution by Gyanaratnavali in his commentary on the Tantraloka, in which he reports that Shambhunatha, that was Abhinavagupta's principal guru when he composed the Tantraloka. So he reports that Shambhunatha was the disciple of a certain Sumatinatha, and that Sumatinatha, or Sumati, was a pupil of an unnamed guru, quote, who lived in the Shakta seat of the Deccan, Dakshina Bhumi Vasati. And I've given you the verse there. So the verse said, and there arose among mankind an extraordinary, illustrious, all-powerful Bhairava, that is to say, a person who had become equal to a Bhairava through enlightenment, dwelling in the sacred site that is the seat of the goddess in the Deccan, an authority on Shaivism of the 5 streams, together with the majestic Atimarga, that means the Kaula tradition here. He was succeeded by Sumati. Sumati's principal disciple, the illustrious Shambhunatha, achieved exceptional spiritual attainment from the Pita Jalandhara, not far from Kashmir. So here we have, inside the Kashmirian tradition, a clear reference to the Guru Parappara for this particular form of the Trika, at least, deriving not from Kashmir, but from the Deccan via Jalandhara. Now, one more piece of evidence, which I think is contestable, but nonetheless, I want to mention it. I think one can make a reasonable hypothesis, which is worth checking at greater length, considering in the light of any new evidence that may come to light. And this concerns the cult of the goddess Kamakshi in the temple city, the ancient temple city of Kanchi in South India. Now, the goddess Kamakshi, who has a temple in what is now known as the Kamakoti, is also a seat of one of the Shankaracharyas. This goddess Kamakshi is identified in widespread tradition with the goddess Tripura Sundari. And that cult of the goddess Tripura Sundari that flourished in Kanchi produced its own literature, as we'll see presently. And to some extent, that is a syncretic or syncretistic tradition because it includes sub-padatis, subordinate ritual procedures for the empowerment by certain deities other than Tripura Sundari. And one of those is the goddess Para. And she survived as a separate object of worship within this tradition until she was eventually ousted by the substitution of Bala, another form, a very similar form, in fact, of Tripura Sundari. But at least well into the late Middle Ages, the cult of Para was alive and well, and we'll within the context of the Kanchi cult of Kamakshi. But in the Lalitopakhana, perhaps a rather late work, which glorifies the cult of Kamakshi in her identification with Tripura Sundari, otherwise known as Lalita, hence the name, the story of Lalita, Lalitopakhana. This is a Puranic text. So in the 35th chapter of that text, which is known as the Kanchi Mahatma, the glorification or the greatness of Kanchi, so a tract praising the importance of this site, motivating devotees to visit it, and so forth. The Mahatma is a well-known genre of promotional literature in Sanskrit. So we have this passage, which perhaps you can read at your leisure, but the important thing is that Kanchi is embedded in the pantheon of the Trikas, Kamakshi, excuse me, is embedded here in the pantheon of the Trika. Answering the question, well, let me read the passage. It is interesting enough, I think, to justify this. So the sage Agastya, who's a kind of Tamil culture hero, thought to have brought the culture of the north into Tamil Nadu. The sage Agastya asks Hayagriva, the deity Hayagriva, about the nature of Kamakshi at the very beginning of this Kamakshi Mahatma, this Kanchi Mahatma rather, and he receives the following reply. Now I'll just give you the translation. Who is this illustrious goddess whom we call Kamakshi, who shines forth in this holy city of Kanchi that beautifies the whole world? Two-armed, her slender creeper-like body shining like lightning, with a beauty never seen before, embodying the highest radiance of consciousness, supreme. Thus addressed by Agastya, the all-knowing Hayagriva meditated upon that radiance of Tripura Sundari, his eyes closed in deepest joy. Having done so, he bowed before it in obeisance. He then answered Agastya and said, I shall now impart to you a secret teaching. Hear me, O husband of Lopamudra. The first goddess, she than whom nothing is higher, is Para as consciousness, as pure consciousness. The first cause, the cause of all manifestation. Those who contemplate the nature of the self also refer to her as the nameless one, Anakya, a term more proper in the Krama than the Trika, but here we go. Although it's the Trisha or Bhairava also refers to the goddess as Anamika, or the nameless one, so it may not be a reference to the Trika. From her, this first goddess, arose the second power, pure Para, pure unmingled with others. So there are two Paras, and this is exactly as in the Krama we see, as in the Trika that we see in Tantraloka. Two-armed, she shows with her right hand the gesture of meditative absorption, placing at the level of her heart with the tips of the thumb and index finger joined to form a circle, and holds a manuscript in the left hand. Her body shines white as snow, jasmine, the moon, and pearls. Third is Parappara, red with the radiance of a myriad of rising suns. She is decked out with every variety of adornment, holding a lotus in her right hand and placing her left hand on her left thigh. She wears a crown and the new moon upon it. After her came Appara. This is the red four-armed Tripura Sundari. She carries a noose, a goad, a sugarcane bowl, and a set of 5 arrows. It is the same goddess, Lalita, who has become famous in Kanchi as Kamakshi. Now, what is surprising about that is that all our other evidence of the cult of Lalita, Tripura Sundari in Kanchi accommodates the Trika in a kind of subset of itself. It has a particular Parappara or Parakrama, which it includes in the cycle of worship, but it's a secondary, definitely ancillary cult. Whereas here at the very beginning of this Kanchi Mahatmyam, the goddess is fitted into a Trika pantheon. Kamakshi is identified with Tripura, who actually has a quite different iconography. She is four-armed, whereas Kamakshi is two-armed. And this Tripura is identified with the Trika's Appara, the lowest of the 3 goddesses that emanate from the 4th. Now, in the Trika proper, the goddess Appara is a fearsome black or dark red Karpalika goddess. Here she's become a rather mild and benevolent figure. So there's been some alteration to the iconography, or else this is a separate tradition, which we only see here. It's impossible from the evidence, I think, at present to settle that question. But the point I want to make is that this is rather unique in the literature I've seen for this cult. and may well go back to to an early stratum of the cult. Although the Lalitoparkhyana is a late text, the tradition of the worship of Kamakshi and her resident Shiva, that is Ekamareshwara, is already attested in very early sources. I think the earliest of which I'm aware is the Shakta Shiva Nishi Samchara Tantra, which survives in a single Nepalese palm leaf manuscript, which mentions these as the deities presiding in Kanchi. So it's an old tradition. And because we don't have here a reference to the one form of the Trika that we will see here in Kanchi in later times, I'm tempted to the conclusion that this is a tradition which goes right back to the origin of glorifying this tradition at a time before the emergence of some of the later Kaula forms. The matter is not proved, but I think it's at least a hypothesis worth entertaining that this Trika presence in Kanchi is quite an ancient one. Now, let me turn to the form of the Trika which is attested widely in this South Indian context, and that is the system which is known as the Anuttara, literally the unsurpassed, also known as the Parappara, the procedure for the propitiation of the goddess Para, or the Ekavi, the procedure for the propitiation of the goddess without consort. Ekavi being solitary hero, or in this case, heroine. Now, this system, of course, is present in Kashmir. We saw it before. We have a wonderful and extremely difficult commentary by Abhinavagupta, a long prose commentary on its very short scripture, the work which he refers to as the Trika, meaning the goddess of the three who transcends the three. So this is Para in her higher aspect that transcends the triadic structure. And the feature of this cult is that it's an extremely simplified liturgy based upon the worship of Para alone. She doesn't even get worship with her angas, with her ancillaries. It's a pure cult of Para Devi. Now, this seems to have enjoyed considerable popularity in the South, perhaps precisely because of its very simple, straightforward, you might say pure nature. It's not, if I can say this, it's not full of distraction by elaborate detail. It's a very simple, straightforward cult. And this opens it to the possibility of systematic encoding with metaphysical meaning. If you have too complicated a ritual system, you're going to leave far too much unencoded. It's just too much to work out. But if you can simplify your tantric kalpa down to a very small core of deities, then it's possible to read in, to transform it into a kind of meditative worship in which each stage of worship is endowed with, is seen as a reiteration of the fundamental doctrines elaborated in the Kashmirian Śākta Shiva philosophical tradition. So what we find in these, the Anuttara texts in South India is a new kind of worship, which we don't see in Kashmir exactly, except perhaps in the Krama. There perhaps we can say that what was originally a rough-edged ritual system with all kinds of unassimilable elements has been polished and refined so that it becomes kind of inculcation of the nature of reality through the order of worship. The same thing we find here being developed in the South for this Anuttara subsystem of the Trika. And we have a number of texts which do this. The basis of the tradition seems to be a work known as the Laghu Vritti, or the short commentary on the Trishika, or Paratrimshika as it's often called. And this work has been published and edited and translated as a work by Abhinavagupta. I think this is not correct. I don't think the work is by Abhinavagupta. I think it's a South Indian work. There are many reasons for that, which I don't need to go into here, I think. But the simplest of them is perhaps that the work simply isn't on the same intellectual level as the works of Abhinavagupta. So short of claiming that he wrote this in his dotage, I think it's rather unlikely that it's from the pen of Abhinavagupta himself. In any case, the text as commented upon in the Laghuvriti, is not the same in all respects as the text commented on in the Para Trimshika or Trishika Vivarana, the work that is genuinely by Abhinavagupta. Rather unlikely that he would be having two different redactions of the text and writing commentaries on each of those redactions without pointing to that fact at least. So we have this work, the Trishika Laghuvriti, also known as the Anuttara Vimarshani, a work which is of uncertain antiquity, but it is attributed to Abhinavagupta already by the South Indian scholar Maheshwarananda in his Maharata or Krama work, Maharata Manjuri Parimala. We also have a work, the Trishika Laghuvriti Vimarshani, which is a commentary on the Trishika Laghuvriti, which I'm afraid I have not yet had access to. I look forward to filling in that gap at some point before too long. Then we do have a work called the Trishika Tatparya Deepika by an unnamed author. And this is a particularly fascinating work, and it's extremely frustrating that the one manuscript in which it has reached us, had reached the editors rather, because it has been published, it's extremely corrupted. It's a very sophisticated work, but the degree of textual corruption is really baffling on occasions. It's been quite difficult to contemplate doing an edition of the whole text, but the passage I've given you here, I think, has been resolved through my emendations. And let me just read it to you because I think it is rather interesting. It begins with veneration of Ganesha, nothing surprising there. He's the remover of obstacles. And then in the second verse, he venerates the goddess Para, giving a brief visualization verse, which occurs often in the ritual manuals for the worship of Para in South India. May the highest Shakti protect you, white as the moon's disk without its marks, three-eyed, her hair adorned with the sickle moon, her two arms beautiful with the gesture of knowledge, and the manuscript of her scripture shown by her hands. So gnosis, gesture in one hand, manuscript in the other. I praise the god, now he turns to Bhairava or Shiva, I praise the god adorned with a new moon, who, as the revealer of the Trika's teachings, is present on Mount Kailasa in Kashmir, Benares, and Chidambaram, which he refers to here as Vyagrapuri, a common name for that city. So there is a very clear claim that this tradition of the Trika is present outside Kashmir. We can pass on Kailasa. I don't think anyone would be studying on the top of Mount Kailasa. But in Benares and Chidambaram, of course, we have, as well as Kashmir, we have the statement here that these are three centers for the propagation and study of the Trika. And Chidambaram, the temple city of Nataraja, the dancing Shiva, which everyone has seen, who knows India, perhaps the iconic image of Shaivism, the dancing Shiva of Chidambaram. At the end of the work, the verses I've just read are from the very beginning of the work, introducing the work. He ends as follows, an unfortunately corrupted verse, but a series of verses, but I think I've reached at least 90% of the truth here. Behold, here in Chidambaram, the town of the Lord, who is the source of the subtle pulse of manifestation, the spanda, the town of the Lord of the hall of consciousness, the Chit Parishat, which is a synonym of Chit Sabha, which is a well-known center of the temple where Nataraja is installed. So here in the city of Chidambaram, I sing the praise of young Shodashi, Sudati Shodashi. Shodashi here is the goddess Para, the Shakti of Anuttara Shiva, the Shakti of highest Shiva. The Trishika has already been explained by Abhinavagupta in his analytic commentary, the Trishika Vivarana. But Nataraja himself, the creator of the dramatic dance that is the 5 cosmic acts, by choosing to enter a remarkable man rich in piety, has in this way manifested from his own lips, as it were, this new explanation of that scripture, Shiva's own most intimate revelation, the mirror of his radiance. He has named it Tatparya Deepika, literally illuminator of the gist, because it does not offer a verse-by-verse commentary, but clarifies only the text's core teachings. Yet it contains the Trishika's intention in its entirety, omitting nothing. May this commentary shine far and wide, having attained a permanent place in the presence of him who with his consort Sarvamangala is eternally engaged in the task of his cosmic dance in the heart of the space within the hall of consciousness, the Chitsabha of Chidambaram. If only the texts were better transmitted. One can live in hope of encountering a less corrupted manuscript. This should not be interpreted as a slander against the accuracy of Tamil scribes, not at all. The problem for us here in the 21st century, or in my case, 20th and 21st century, is that the texts have reached us after many, many recopyings. Because of the climatic conditions of southern India, palm leaf does not have a very long life. So manuscripts get worn out quite quickly, devoured by insects and the like, and need to be recopied much more frequently than in the Kathmandu Valley, where we have intact manuscripts surviving from the 9th century and many from the 10th. This is not the case in South India. So the simple climatic fact that the humid and hot climate of South India, the tropical climate, devours all organic matter with great speed, has led to a progressive accumulation of errors, which makes sometimes it very difficult to see through the errors to what was behind, to get back to the text that we have. Yeah. Now, I've listed after that a number of other texts which are in this tradition of the Parakrama. I don't want to go through them all one by one. You've got some names there. I want to point out, though, that what we do have, which we do not have from the north, from Kashmir, or from the Kathmandu Valley, are two main resources for manuscripts in these non-Saidanic traditions. What we do not have from there are padatis for the worship of Para, and we do have those from South India. And I've listed them there. The one with the asterisk is one that I've given a name. This material survives in miscellaneous ritual materials which have been preserved in Grantha manuscripts, of which there are now Devanagari transcripts in the Institute of Indology in Pondicherry, from where I've been able to study them easily thanks to the gracious help of those who run that august institution. So some of these are just rather humble materials which are floating around in bundles of such materials, often without a beginning or an end. They're sometimes rather messy collections of incomplete ritual materials. But we have a number of complete texts. The first one, the Anuttara Samvidarchana Charcha, which survives in Trivandrum, gives us a complete account of the ritual. And it's a perfect example of what we can, I think, refer to as Vasana Krama, a text which sets out the mental ritual, as it were, the ideations that should accompany the ritual actions. What should you see sitting down in the seat as? How should you understand the ritual bath? All these become metaphors for internal transformations of various kinds, culminating in enlightenment. So this is a strong characteristic of these Anuttara Padatis. We also have a complete text, which is actually called Parakrama Vasana, the inner ideation that animates the Parakrama, the Vasana, the mental impressions that underlie Parakrama, by a certain Shambhavananda in a massive work of his called the Paramashiva-dvaita Kalpalatika, to which I shall return. And then we have two padatis for the propitiation of Para found inside the Parashurama Kalpa Sutra, which is produced in Kanchi for this its own peculiar syncretistic version of Tripura Sundari worship. I told you there is a subcult of Para within its system. So we have two padatis from there. One from Umananda's Nityotsava, which is based upon the Parashurama Kalpa Sutra, and another within the commentary of Rameshwara, composed on the whole Parashurama Kalpa Sutra. Notice the dates. The first is dated in 1745, the second in 1831. This tradition of Tripura Sundari worship, based upon the Parashurama Kalpa Sutra, has been vigorous almost down to modern times, and perhaps it'd be fair to say it still is vigorous, at least in the Tamil world. So there is this rich tradition of the Trika in its Anuttara form, which has been going on in South India for centuries. But I think in the wake of the Kashmirian tradition, not before it. Everything we have indicates complete permeation by the metaphysical notions elaborated by the Kashmirian acharyas in the 10th and 11th centuries. Now, is this Anuttara system found only in South India? Well, I don't have a complete answer to that, but I can say that it's not only found there, it's also found in Orissa, in Eastern India. I've published 2 short tracts, the Para Japa Vidhi and Para Mantra Vidhi, which have been preserved in the Angirasa Kalpa of the Paipalada Atharva Vedins in that part of India, in Orissa. And this form of the Anuttara agrees precisely with that which we see in the South Indian sources, the same redaction of the text, the same ritual moves, the same ritual vasanas, everything is the same. And I think it's most reasonable to assume that this Orissan tradition entered not from Kashmir, but from the south, which it adjoins, of course. The Orissa stretches down into Kalinga, which is contiguous with the Tamil or Telugu and Tamil universe. Now, what about the Trika elsewhere? Is there any evidence of it having flourished elsewhere than in the Deccan? Well, yes, we have evidence that it was known in Eastern India, including Nepal. Now, I include Nepal within the category of Eastern India because my impression is that, culturally speaking, the Kathmandu Valley is open to the east, not to the north and west. There's very little evidence of any Kashmirian Shiva influence coming into the Kathmandu Valley. There's not no evidence, but the evidence is very peripheral, very minor. And on the other hand, it's very clear that there was a continuity, shared tradition between the world of the Palas and Sena monarchs in Magadha and Gauda, Eastern India, and the Kathmandu Valley. So I think it's reasonable to say that the culture of the Kathmandu Valley looks east, and what is preserved in it, it's a very conservative and sheltered region, what is preserved there are traditions that were once much more widespread in East India. So as for Trika scriptures, we have some surviving in the Kathmandu Valley. We have a short redaction of the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata. When I say surviving in the Kathmandu Valley, I should say surviving in it or from it, because some of these manuscripts have left the valley. So we have a short recension of the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata on the fundamental text of the Trika. We have 2 very old manuscripts on palm leaf of the Tantra Sadbhava, which I mentioned earlier, and we have a small fragment, frustratingly small fragment of the Trika Sara, a later and more esoteric text of the Trika, which Abhinavagupta cites quite often. Now, we also have evidence of Eastern scholars being aware of these traditions. So Trika and related texts are cited in the Vimalavati. This is a Siddhantika Padati, ritual compendium, compiled or composed rather in verse by a scholar called Vimala Shiva, who was the Raja Guru of the king of Magadha, who was known as Malaya Singha. And he was a disciple of Dharma Shiva, who was the Raja Guru of the king of Dandabukti, which is basically the Midnapur district of West Bengal. And in this text, a very interesting text, we see that he's fully familiar with the Kashmirian tradition. You can see this from his citations of non-Siddhantika works. He cites the Netra Tantra, the Swachanda, and the Swachanda Udyota of Kshemaraja. Then he cites the Malni Vidyotra of the Trika, which in his time had become perhaps the principal basis of Trika exegesis as a result of the work of Abhinavagupta. He also cites the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata and the Tantra Loka itself, though he doesn't name it, but he does reproduce a passage from it. And finally, the Kubjika Mata, the text of the Paschimamnai, which I've mentioned several times now. Finally, Vimala Shiva tells us that he went to Kashmir to study the tantric traditions, and also that he is now resident in Benares rather than Eastern India. But it's a quite common feature I found that Raja Gurus of East Indian kings are resident in Benares. They don't have to be, as it were, at the beck and call of their monarch. That may be true of Raja Purohitas, royal chaplains. It's not true of Diksha Gurus, who, as it were, preside in their matas in places such as Benares, and might travel on occasion to perform rituals elsewhere for their devotees, and often royal devotees. Or, of course, the alternative is that Benares was within the realm of these kings, and that the kings themselves more likely traveled to the mata or ashram of the Rajaguru for this purpose. So there at least we have some evidence of familiarity with Trika texts in Eastern India. And we also, by the way, have evidence of such knowledge on the part of Gyana Shiva, another Siddhantika author, in his Siddhantika Padati Gyanaratnavali. Now, Gyana Shiva was from Chola Desha in the south, but like Vimala Shiva, he was residing in Benares, and he shows this by declaring himself to be an ardent devotee, both of the Lord of the Little Hall, that means Nataraja, and Nataraja of Chidambaram in the Tamil country, and also of Vishweshwara or Vishwanatha, the principal Shiva of Varanasi by this period. And this author, Gyana Shiva, was active around the middle of the 12th century. So I've given a list of the texts that he has cited. And again, you see Swachanda Bhairava, no Netra mentioned here, Swachanda Bhairava, Malini Vijaya, Siddhogeshwari Mata, and then two Paschimamnaya texts, the Nirgura Gyanarnava and the Kulalikamnaya, both texts of the Paschimamnaya. And finally, the Maha Kaula Gyana Nirnaya, which is the same as the work which was published by Bagchi as an early Kaula scripture. Now, what about Western India? Let's say the region of Malwa, Gujarat, etc. Well, we have Trika scriptures which have been accepted by Hridaya Shiva of Malwa in the West, in his digest of scriptural passages on penances taken from a wide range of Shaiva scripture, not just Siddhantika, although Hridaya Shiva was a Siddhantika Acharya. He, in fact, gives us citations from 3 texts which he says are in the tradition of the Siddhogeshwari Mata, which says only that they're Trika works, the Trika Sarottara, the Bija Beda, and the Bhairavodhyana, the last, I think, an alias of the Trishya or Bhairava for reasons I can't go into here. And he was active probably during the 11th century. We have limits on the date, which I've stated in that paragraph underneath the titles. Now, leaving the Trika behind, we've seen that it's actually quite widely attested elsewhere. And I think in the case of Western India, there's no strong reason to think that it was there as a result or influenced by the Kashmirian representations of the Trika that we see in the works of Abhinavagupta and others. It seems to me, in the light of other evidence that we have, that the Trika was present in other parts of India, that we shouldn't jump to that conclusion. Just because we see the Trika in a region that is not Kashmir, we don't need to conclude that it's come from Kashmir directly or at all. Now I want to move on to the fate of the Kali Kula, or Maharata, otherwise known as Mahanaya or Krama, in southern India. Now there we have a number of very important works, some of them quite brilliant. The first, and the one that is best known, I think, is the Maharata Manjuri, which is a work of about 70 verses written in Maharashtri Prakrit, with an elaborate Sanskrit prose commentary by the author, known as the Parimala. And he was active around 1300 AD in the region of Chidambaram. He also wrote a couple of other works that pertain to the Maharata system, the Padakordaya and the Maharatodaya, which survive only in citations which he's given from them in his Maharata Manjuri Parimala. A number of other works of the Krama are mentioned, are cited by the Maharata Manjuri Parimala, which we do not have access to from other sources. I've given one there, the Kramodaya. After that, I've listed the Chid Gagana Chandrika, which has been published at least twice. Unfortunately, there too, the state of the manuscripts has led to a very corrupted text. And since the text is a very sophisticated one, written in high Kavya style on a very esoteric subject, fighting one's way through the corruptions is not an easy task. I've been doing it on and off for decades, wondering whether I'd ever reach a degree of competence that would enable me to sweep away all the debris that's accumulated over the centuries. Not quite there yet, I'm afraid. So the Chid Gagana Chandrika seems to me to be a South Indian work, although it is strongly dependent on a Kashmirian work of the Krama, which I listed last time, the Mahanaya Prakasha of the Kashmirian Kulacharya Arna Singha, who was active in the second half of the 11th century. And this work has been cited in the Maharata Manjuri. And I've given reasons for concluding that although the provenance is uncertain, it's pretty clear that it must be South India. The work is not known in the north until very late, after works from the east, which knew that we're in touch with the south, had come into the Kashmir Valley. So it's not one of the works known to Kashmirian scholarship until very late. And the author also says that he composed the work in the Purna Pita, and Purna Pita is a well-known, or at least common, abbreviation of Purnagiri Pita, in the sacred throne or sacred seat of the goddess in Purnagiri. Now, sadly, we have yet to identify Purnagiri beyond doubt. What we do know is that it was in the Deccan. So everything points towards a South Indian origin for that text. And I've listed under 6, under the Maharata Mahānaya Krama in southern India on page 9 at the bottom, sub-entry 6 reads Krama scriptures quoted by Maheshwarananda, and you have 4 there, of which only 1 survives, and that has reached us in the Kathmandu Valley, the Krama Sadbhava. That's an abbreviated reference to the Kali Kula Krama Sadbhava, of which we have 1 incomplete paper manuscript in the Nawari script. I've listed under 7 various other Krama works quoted by Maheshwarananda, including the 2 Mahanaya Prakashas, that of the Kashmirian Arna Singha, already mentioned, and that published from Trivandrum. Unfortunately, without its author, the very last folio of the manuscript has been lost, and that, of course, is where we get the statement of authorship. So we just don't know. It was claimed by the editor that local tradition said it was by Abhinavagupta. I can see why they might come to that conclusion. It is a very brilliant work, written within the conceptual framework of the Pratyabhigya tradition, but it is, for various reasons, not by Abhinavagupta himself. Now, let me turn to Maharata texts that have reached recent times in South Indian manuscripts. We have the Maharata Manjuri Parimala, the Mahanaya Prakasha of unknown authorship, that's the Trivandrum one, and the Chid Gagana Chandrika of Srivatsa. Those works we have, all in South Indian manuscripts. Then we have, here I've listed under D, a work which we do not have, sadly. It's listed in a list of the manuscripts of the Deshamangalam Varyam, the Varya family home in Deshamangalam, which is in the Malappuram district of Kerala. This was an extensive family, part of an extensive family collection of manuscripts by this learned family of Varyars, which was swept away in the floods of August 1907. An enormous loss. There are a number of unique works listed there. And one of them is this Maharata Kalpa, which from its title looks like a ritual manual for the worship of the Maharata, for the worship of this Krama system. So it's a sad loss. No doubt many other works were considered more sad to have been lost, but from my point of view, the loss of Maharata Kalpa is a great pity. Now, I've written quite a lot about that particular text, mainly because I was fascinated to see that the owners were not Brahmin scholars. They were Sanskrit scholars of the non-Brahmin Varyar caste. And the Varyars refer to themselves, when they're writing Sanskrit, as Parashavas. And the Parashavas, theoretically the subcaste, a mixed caste, descended, according to Dharmashastric statements, from the marriage of or the union, I should say, of a Brahmin male and a Shudra woman. But the idea that, well, the Parashavas are well attested outside Kerala also, with regard to the cult of the mother goddesses, the Matrika that we see in the Yamala literature of South India, which deals with the propitiation of these mother goddesses, largely for the protection of the state. And I've discussed that to some extent in my study, Atharva Vedans in Tantric territory. Now these Varyars are useful to look at because they are non-Brahmins, and we tend to assume that Brahmanical scholarship, that is to say Sanskrit learned scholarship, is pretty much the monopoly of Brahmins. Well, here's a very good exception to that case, a very striking exception. These are not Brahmins. The Varyars traditionally are assistants in the Shaiva temple worship to the Nambudiri Brahmins, who are the tantris or supervisors of the guides of the ritual life of temples in Kerala. They're also known as Rudra Dasas, slaves of Rudra, and Kailasa Vasins, those who dwell on Mount Kailasa, presumably an allusion to their Rudra nature. And the interesting thing is that we have these lists of the manuscripts that were once in this precious collection, and we can see from these lists that the library actually had a number of texts in this tradition. It had a manuscript of the Maharata Manjuri Parimala, more than one manuscript of the Chid Gagana Chandrika, and then a list you'll see there following that on this page 10, a list of the principal works of the Shaiva non-dualist philosophical tradition, beginning with the Shiva Drishti of Somananda and passing on to the Ishvara Pratibhigya Karika and its Vimarshni by Abhinavagupta. And then also note the Trishika Laghuvriti, this foundational text for the Parakrama, which we saw earlier, and some other works, which we needn't go into here. Then I want to move on to Padhatis of southern Indian origin, of South Indian origin, surviving in the Kathmandu Valley. And this may come as something of a surprise. We have a work called the Kali Kula Kramarchana, an elaborate blow-by-blow account of the ritual of worshipping the goddess Guhyakali. Guhyakali was one of the esoteric goddesses of the Malla kings, and there's a lot of ritual material dealing with her propitiation, surviving in the Kathmandu Valley. And of course, the cult survives to this day. Now, this Kali Kula Kramarchana was written by Vimala Prabodha, an ascetic, Ekadandi sannyasi, in fact, who was the guru of the Nepalese king Arimala, who ruled in Kathmandu between AD 1200 and 1216. And attached to that, though surviving very far away in the Cambridge University Library, is the Maharata Mantrapadati, which simply gives in order all the mantras which have to be used in this worship of Guhyakali. So it gives us what we have from these two texts is, well, the Maharata Mantrapadati doesn't add anything, but it does act as a check on the reading of the mantras found in our manuscripts of the Kali Kula Kramarchana, of which there are several, by the way. Now, what is striking about this work is that in this Kali Kula Kramarchana, we see a distinct variant of the Maharata, distinct from that which was practiced in Kashmir, which exactly matches that which we see in the Maharata Manjuri Parimala of the Tamil Maheshwarananda. And not just there, we find the same variant of the Maharata in two related South Indian syncretistic Kaula Padhatis, the Ananda Kalpa Latika of the splendidly named Maheshwara Tejanandanata, and also in the Padya Vahini of Shankara. Now this system, this variant of the Maharata, is put to work by Vimala Prabodha as a padhati for the worship of the Nepalese goddess Guhyakali, who with Kubjika and Siddhi Lakshmi, that's how they mispronounce Siddha Lakshmi, she should be Siddha Lakshmi, but in Kathmandu Valley she's become Siddhi Lakshmi. So this is a padhati for the worship of Guhyakali, who with Kubjika and Siddhi Lakshmi plays a major role in the royal Śāktism of the Malla period. The Kali Kula Kramarchana and the ancillary Maharata Mantrapadati provide all the details of mantras, deity names, visualizations, and the like that are mostly lacking in the more theoretically orientated Maharata Manjuri Parimala. Indeed, the author of that work quotes the Krama Sadbhava to the effect that one must not disclose the names of the deities that form the various cycles of worship and contemplation in the Krama. So it justifies its silence. So it does occasionally refer to a list of such deities by mentioning the first of them. I seem to remember he talks about Hamsamatyadinam, those beginning with Hamsamati, which is the first of a series of deities in one of these cycles. And no visualizations are given, no mantras, except one or two of the crucial seeds which are endowed with mystical significance. But the actual mantras to be recited in the course of worship are left to the oral tradition. So this is the great benefit of the Kali Kula Kramarchana, is that it fills in all that detail for us. And this detail is confirmed by those two other syncretistic texts I mentioned, the Ananda Kalpalatika and the Padyavahini, both unpublished. Unfortunately, the Ananda Kalpalatika and the Padyavahini are appallingly transmitted. They're just riddled with errors. And this becomes particularly acute when it comes to the mantras, because when a scribe copies mantras, he's not looking at things that have a meaning in the dictionary, so to speak. And so they're very liable to corruption. But fortunately, we do have the much better transmitted Kali Kula Kramarchana. So if one wished to resuscitate this tradition, we have the means of doing so. Now, this section comes under the heading Padditis of South Indian origin surviving in the Kathmandu Valley. So what is the evidence that this is a South Indian tradition? Well, I've pointed to the fact that the system of propitiation here agrees exactly with what we see in three South Indian sources, the Maharata Manjuri Parimala, the Ananda Kalpalatika, and the Padyavahini. But there are also features within the Kali Kula Kramarchana which point in that direction. And the most striking of these, I think, is the fact that there are what are called variously chumma, choma, or chomakas, which are secret expressions which have to be used by sadhakas, by practitioners, male and female, when they meet together for collective orgiastic worship. And these chomakani, as they're called in the case of the Kali Kula Kramarchana, have to be uttered at the beginning of each of the sequences of worship. And these sequences are those of Shrishti, Sthiti, Samhara, Anakya, and Basa in the pentadic system of this variant of the Krama. The order of emission, the order of stasis, the order of resorption, the order of the nameless, which remains after the resorption of resorption, and then final quiescence, referred to as the pure light, Bhasa Krama, the pure light representing final quiescence. Now, the words to be uttered according to this text are not Sanskritic. And I'm not a Dravidianist at all. I don't know any Dravidian language, but I can use the Dravidian Etymological Dictionary, that wonderful work by Emino and by my revered former teacher, Professor Thomas Burrow. And you can see there from the handout on page 11 why I conclude that these expostulations to be uttered during the phases of these phases of ritual are Dravidian in origin. Ha, Tamil R, to come into existence, hitti, from hidi, which means to hold, to grasp, to hold on to cling to, kre, from Tamil karai, to dissolve, to become gradually attenuated, ara, from compare Tamil ar, to become full, to be satisfied, and the same word in Kannada, meaning to abound, to be filled, which is exactly what's happening in the nameless phase. And then finally, kuluru, corresponding, which is to be uttered during the Basa Krama, the phase of pure light, representing final quiescence. Consider Tamil kulir, to feel cooled, get numbed as in death, to be satisfied, to sit, to rest. Kannada kulir, to be cool or cold. And Malayalam kulir and kullur, coldness, cool, refreshing. And you notice that these are reduplicated, ha, hitti, etc. These expressions have the appearance of second person singular imperatives, consisting as in Tamil of the simple base of the verb. Each is repeated once. This is known as an attuku, a stacked construction that is common in Tamil as a means of expressing intensity, certainty, urgency, or repetition of the action of the verb. Now, there are many fascinating things about this Kali Kula Kramarchana. And one of them is that he cites quite a large number of scriptural sources as the source of his particular accounts of his accounts of this or that ritual in the course of this compendium of the rituals of the Maharata for the propitiation of Guhya Kali. And I've given you there a list, I think a complete list of the 10 works on which he draws, or which he cites. Beginning with the Krama Sadbhava and ending with the Gyanaratnavali Yamala. Only the first and last, the Krama Sadbhava and the Gyanaratnavali Yamala, have reached us down to modern times. The others are completely unknown. I've seen no other references to these, and their very number points to a very rich and vigorous South Indian tradition, of which has simply been lost to sight. And I've added there, under that heading, palatis of South Indian origin surviving in the Kathmandu Valley, and so on. I've added that there is a reference in the south of India also to the Gyanaratnavali Yamala. It appears in the great commentary on the Nitya Shodashikarnava, the early Tripura Sundari text, the commentary by Vidyanandanata, the Artha Ratnavali, where it's been disguised by a mistake in the edition following what is clearly a corrupt reading, where a long passage from the first Shakta of the Gyanaratnavali Yamala is cited as from the mantra Rajya. This should be Tantra Rajya, following the reading of one of his manuscripts, which he helpfully records in his apparatus. And that has to be right, because Tantra Raja is the way the text refers to itself, and it is always referred to in this way by Gyanaratnavali in his commentary on the Tantra Loka. He calls it the Tantra Raja, or with the honorific, Tantra Raja Bhattaraka. One more piece of evidence of the presence of the Kali Kula tradition, the Krama-oriented, Maharata-oriented worship of Kali. We have the Urmi Kaularnava, manuscripts of the Urmi Kaularnava surviving in the Kathmandu Valley. And at the end of that work, it clearly states that it was first revealed in Kamarupa, in the modern state of Assam, around the area of Guwahati, and subsequently was transported, of course, miraculously through the air, to Kaulagiri in the far south, in the Deccan, and Kaulagiri is Kolhapura, not the far south, I should say, rather the borders between near the border of, the southern border of Maharashtra, close to the border with Karnataka. The city which is the site of the great temple of the goddess Mahalakshmi, which I think to be the Dakshina Bhumi Pita, by the way, which was specified as the seat of the Guru of Shambhunatha, the Guru of Abhinavagupta. Now, what about the Kali, Kula and Maharata in Eastern India and Nepal? Well, we've already covered a certain amount of that incidentally, but I've listed these things separately. We have a manuscript of the Kali Kula Panchashataka, one of the principal scriptures of the Krama, written in the Magadha script, with a date in the Lakshmana Sena Samvat, in the era of Lakshmana Sena, the Sena king of Eastern India. This manuscript, by the way, was in the property of that Guru Vimala Prabodha, who introduced the South Indian system. And indeed, it's thanks to him that we have a number of these Krama works surviving in Nepal. They were studied and copied. We have several manuscripts of the Kali Kula Panchashataka, only one, unfortunately, of the Kali Kula Krama Sadbhava, one, I think, of the Devi Dvarda Shataka, to my knowledge, one of the Yoni Gahura, a couple, perhaps, yes, I think two of the Kala Sankarshni Mata, and the other works have been listed there, you can see. And we, of course, we have Urmi Kaularnava manuscripts in the Kathmandu Valley. I've mentioned that already. And the most precious of these surviving materials is the Gyanaratnavali Yamala. We have complete manuscripts of all 4 of the sections, they're called Shatkas, of the Gyanaratnavali Yamala, called Shatkas because they're supposed to consist of 6,000 verses each, making a total of 24,000 stanzas for the whole work. In fact, the total is slightly less than that. It's not a precise numeration. We also have a large number of anonymous Nepalese, or should we say rather Newar, ritual manuals, often with added instructions in the Newari language, for the propitiation of Guhya Kali and Siddha Lakshmi, or if you like, Siddhi Lakshmi in the Nepalese style, either worshipped independently or together with Kubjika and Tripura Sundari. What developed among the Karmacharyas of the Kathmandu Valley was a syncretistic liturgy which venerates in turn Siddha Lakshmi, Guhya Kali, not necessarily in this order, Guhya Kali, Siddha Lakshmi, Kubjika, and then tagged on, I think at a later date, Tripura Sundari. And this matrix is used in a wide variety of rituals for the worship of other deities. It became, as it were, the standard Karmacharya liturgical format, incorporating the accumulated royal deities over time. And my hypothesis is that we have this accumulation because the royal shrines to the tantric goddesses had accumulated a number of deities over time. And so their officiants developed paddatis, manuals, which duly acknowledge all of them. And we also have a later literature inspired by the Krama, although the Krama details begin to get somewhat etiolated, they fade a bit. We have works like the Haharava Tantra, the Guhya Tantra, and the Sapta Mundra Kramogra Bheda. And then finally, we have this vast work, the Mahakala Samhita, which seems to have been compiled in Mithila in the later medieval period, which has a large section devoted to the propitiation of Guhya Kali. And this represents a later Baroque elaboration of the cult of Guhya Kali, which also shows certain signs of expurgation of the more challenging aspects of Kaula practice. So, for example, the use of wine is permitted, but not to Brahmins. There are various restrictions introduced, indicating that this text has been produced in a tradition of Śākta Brahmins who are nonetheless subject, feel strongly the need to conform to mainstream Brahmanical restrictions. Now, as for the Paschimam Naya, the Paschimam Naya in Eastern India, first of all, the tradition of Kubjika worship, here it does seem to have flourished and perhaps even originated, well, not originated, but certainly have taken root and flourished. So we have a palm leaf manuscript of the short recension of the Kubjika Mata known as the Lagvikam Naya in the old Newari script, which was completed in AD 1037. We have a manuscript of the Kubjika Mata produced likewise in the 11th century, written in the Pala script with corrections and additions in the Maitila or early Bengali script in the margins and between the lines. Clearly this was a text in use in Eastern India, not in the Kathmandu Valley. It reached the Kathmandu Valley later. We have another palm leaf manuscript of the Kubjika Mata in the Bengali script, which was not used at all in Nepal. Another one, item 4 there, a palm leaf manuscript of the Kubjika Mata in early Maitila or Gauda script, again East Indian. We have numerous Nepalese manuscripts of the Kubjika Mata, the Shatsahasra Samhita, which is a more elaborate treatment of the same material. And we have, in fact, have a simple gloss, a tipana on this work, the Shatsahasra Samhita. Then we have the Nityaknika Tilaka of Jaya, an early Padati, which reaches us in Nepalese and East Indian manuscripts, and the earliest of these is dated in the 13th century. We have the Nitya Prakasha of Veera Chandra, a ritual manual for the propitiation of Kubjika and her consort Navatman, which was composed in AD 1072-3, and this author was an East Indian. This is preserved again in Nepalese manuscripts. We have a commentary on that text, the Nitya Prakasha Vivarana Panjika, also called Nitya Kaumadi, written by the chief disciple of Veera Chandra, one Gangadhara, and we learn from the manuscript that this work was produced at the request of Gangadhara's pupil Shambhudatta, who we are told was the personal physician of the Pala monarch Ramapala, who ruled from about 772 to 1126. And we have Nepalese manuscripts of this text. Finally, we have the Sri Matapadati, also called Siddha Santana Sopana Pankti, by Yasoraja, or rather Jasoraja, slightly modernized form of the name. In Sanskrit, it is strictly speaking Yashoraja, of which we have an incomplete copy in a composite Nepalese codex of the 12th century. Its discovery in this composite codex alerted me, well, I knew it already, but one should never forget this, that even though a title may not appear in a catalogue, it may well be in the library, because very often you have these composite manuscripts of which only the last item has been recorded. The cataloguer has opened the bundle, turned to the end, seen a colophon and a title, and recorded that, but not noticed that there are earlier works, other works contained in the bundle. Always worth looking out. And this keeps hope alive that new materials may turn up. Then, of course, in the Kathmandu Valley, we have very numerous Newa manuals for the propitiation of Kubjika and her consort Navatma Bhairava. So it became very well established in the Kathmandu Valley. And this reflected, or was a consequence perhaps, of the popularity of this cult in royal circles in Eastern India, not in provincial Nepal, but in Eastern India. But now it survives only in this isolated pocket of tantric culture, which is due to the isolation of Nepal, has been preserved almost down to modern times. Of course, it's under threat now, under stress, but nonetheless, these traditions continue. Now I want to introduce, under my item 9, a variant of the Paschimam Naya, which is found in the south, which goes under the name Sadanvayas Shambhava. We have a scripture of this tradition, the Shambhu Nirnaya, which survives, to my knowledge, in a single manuscript in Madras, along with a commentary on it called the Deepika, the Shambhu Nirnaya Deepika, by the South Indian Shivananda Muni, author of the Riju Vimarshani commentary on the Nitya Shodashi Karnava. This man was the guru of Maheshwarananda Nata, the author of our Maharata Manjuri Parimala, and he was active around 1225 to 1275. Now, apart from these two texts, both of them preserved in Codex Unicus, a single manuscript in Madras, to my knowledge at least, let's hope there are other manuscripts floating around somewhere. We have, in addition to that, we have a Padati, the Sadanvayas Shambhava Krama, which claims to be by a certain Umakanta, disciple of Amritananda Nata, perhaps the Amritananda Nata who produced the commentary on the Yogini Hridaya in the Tripura Sundari tradition, but the name is perhaps not so unusual. And this is interesting because it sets out in very simple form the ritual procedures and the mantras for the propitiation of this variant of the cult of Kubjika and Navatman. This text also cites a few works because it's made in a mixture of verse and prose. It refers to another Kubjikamata, and this work is also quoted by Maheshwarananda. It's not the Kubjikamata we have, but another work of the same title. And that should alert us to a common problem here, that titles are recycled. We have a number of works under the same title. People use them again because the title is proof of venerability. And two other works have been mentioned there by me under 5 and 6, the Charana Sutra and the Rasanvaya. Rasa here stands for the number 6 because there are 6 flavors. So Rasanvaya is a synonym of Sadanvaya, and this system is known as the Sadanvaya Shambhava, the Shambhava system based upon the 6 lines or streams, the Sadanvaya, and these are corresponded with, put into correlation with the 5 gross elements and a transcendent 6th. This tradition became very well known in South India and was incorporated into the expurgated versions of these Kaula traditions, which we find propagated through the mutts of the Shankaracharyas of South India, particularly that of Kanchi. And we find it in the famous Saundarya Lahari, that great hymn to the goddess Tripura Sundari, which has attracted very many commentaries over the centuries. And represents a kind of purified Kaula tradition with the same deities, the same mantras, the same mudras, mandalas, etc., but without the Kaula transgressive elements. So now the worship of Tripura Sundari in South India, this is too large a subject to be gone into in any detail, and it's perhaps already quite well known, that there is a large literature from South India for the propitiation of the goddess Tripura Sundari. And most of it, at least certainly the earlier works from the 13th century onwards, are thoroughly permeated by the perspective and terminology, conceptual categories of the Kashmirian non-dualist Śākta Shaiva tradition. These authors have studied the seminal works of the Kashmirian tradition very closely. They've learned to speak that language, as it were, and unless you're very alert, you might well think you're in Kashmir reading the work of a Kashmirian when you read these texts. They have learnt the language, so to speak, the terminology, the conceptual map of the tradition. Later on, elements come in from Advaita Vedanta. This is somewhat hybridized, and finally we get ritual manuals which rather push that specifically Shaiva metaphysical non-dualism into the background in favor of the Advaita Vedanta system associated with the name of Shankara Bhagavat, and as you well know, propagated and taught by the Shankaracharyas of both Sringeri and Kanchi. So there, on page 14, you have a large number of works mentioned, up to from 4 down to, on this page at least, from 4 down to 9. And after that, I've listed a number of works referring to which teach the cult of Lalita or Kamakshi in Kanchipuram. And this is also a kind of hybridized system, as I think I've already mentioned, because we find in there that Lalita or Tripura Sundari is a central deity, but there are also procedures for the propitiation of associated goddesses who are, as it were, part of her retinue, namely Matangi, also known as Shyama, Varahi, the goddess Varahi, and also Para, the goddess Para of our Anuttara Trika system. There are a large number of works, many of them unpublished, some of them quite vast. One of them, which I have a printout from a copy that was in the hands of a dealer in Oriental antiquities for a while, the Tripararchana Manjuri, enormously heavy thing, which is now sitting in the United States. I'll get it back at some point. Yeah, so there are, and these works go right up to almost modern times. The latest work I've listed there was completed in 1843 by a Brahmin working in the court, one of the courts of Gujarat. Now, turning to the topic of Kaula syncretism in the South, taking that up separately, I've listed 3 main elements there. The first is this Parashurama Kalpa Sutra, which I've already spoken about, which incorporates these sub-padditis. Then we have a hybridized tradition which brings together the cult of Tripura Sundari and the Sadanvayas Shambhava system. We see this in an early work of the Nath Sampradaya, though it doesn't call itself that yet, the tradition that looks back to Goraksha. And this is the Matsyendra Samhita, and this work shows already around the 12th century, around 1200 in fact, this combination of liturgy for the propitiation of Tripura Sundari and also this Paschimamnaya rooted Sadanvayas Shambhava variant. And it's precisely that combination which appears in the hugely popular text, hugely popular among Smarta devotees of the goddess Tripura Sundari, the Saundarya Lahari, which contains within it the Ananda Lahari, which represents this Sadanvaya Shambhava visualization, in which series of goddesses are visualized in the 6 chakras. Then we have a further degree of hybridization, in which we have the combination of the cult of Tripura Sundari, the Sadanvaya Shambhava system, and the Krama or Maharata. All 3 things are brought together. There's an additional mantra cycle introduced, that of the goddess Sampatkari, but we needn't consider that further. The main thing here is that these 3 main streams of the Kaula tradition, the worship of Tripura Sundari, the worship of Kubjika, and the worship of Kala Sankarshni, the Maharata, are brought together. We have this Padyavahini of Shankara, the Ananda Kalpalatika of Maheshwara Tejanandanata, and then a short but rather brilliantly elegant hymn, the Parashambhu Mahimnaha Stotra. There are probably other works there waiting to be identified in the South Indian manuscript libraries or in private collections. So this is a distinctive feature of the later South Indian literature, this attempt to produce a syncretistic system which brings together all these Kaula nayas, the main elements at least of the Kaula tradition at that time. Now, I've pointed out that much of this literature, the great majority of it, in fact, is pervaded by the metaphysical non-dualism of the Kashmirian non-dualists, beginning with Somananda, then going on through Utpaladeva, through to Abhinavagupta and Kshemaraja. So the study of the Pratyabhigya texts was also, of course, cultivated in the far south. And as proof of this, we have a number of texts. One of them, the most impressive, is a large-scale commentary on the Ishvara Pratyabhigya Vimarshani of Abhinavagupta. The Ishvara Pratyabhigya Vimarshani Vyakya. It comes to us in a manuscript which does not indicate the author. Unfortunately, it's anonymous, but we can see that it's a South Indian work from its citations. Then we have a work called the Paramashiva Kalpilatika by a certain Shambhavananda, which is essentially teaching the Kashmirian version of non-dualism, the dynamic non-duality of consciousness, the Samvidadvayavada, and it also incorporates a liturgical tradition, namely the Parakrama, again, going back to that Anuttara cult. So it's a Pratyabhigya text setting up Pratyabhigya doctrine, but also incorporating in its large extent a Padati for the propitiation of the goddess Para, following the Anuttara subsystem of the Trika. What characterizes it is an attempt to reconcile this tradition with the mainstream Smarta Shaiva tradition. As you know, the Smarta Shaivas are the dominant Brahmin community in South India, and they adhere to the doctrines of the Shankara Advaita tradition, the Advaita Vedanta of Shankara. And so there's we see here in this text a desire to reconcile this Kashmirian tradition, which from the point of view of the Orthodox is not rooted in the Veda, it's Veda Bahya, an attempt to show that it is congruent with Shruti and Smriti. So the work is very rich in citations of both those categories of text, particularly citations of the Puranas, which fall within the category of Smriti. As I've said, it also introduces, after demonstrating its doctrine against all opponents, it elaborates a program of internalized worship based upon the system of the Parakrama, and it actually ends with a detailed exposition of the universal Shaiva mantra, Namah Shivaya, or Om Namah Shivaya. Also the mantra of Tripura, the mantra of Para, and the Vedic Gayatri. That should be sufficient to show its ecumenical aspirations. It is bringing together the mantra of Tripura and the mantra of Para with the universal Shaiva mantra, which you don't even need to be initiated to use. And finally, the Vedic Gayatri, which every Upanita Brahmin, or every Upanita twice born knows. So all of these are encoded to embody the truth of this doctrine. And the sources used in this large work are very similar to those of Maheshwarananda in his Maharata Manjuri Parimala, and there's clear evidence that he has drawn extensively on Maheshwarananda's magisterial work. We also have a commentary on the Pratyabhigya, at least on the Gyanadikara of the Pratyabhigya Karika, by a certain Sadananda, who also wrote a commentary on the Trishika, on this Parakrama tradition. Then leaping up to almost modern times, we have Srinivasa Bhatta's commentary, the Tatparya Deepika, on the Jnanakanda of the Tripura Rahasya. This is a work composed in the context of the cult of Kamakshi, or Lalita of Kanchi. Their commentary follows the Kashmirian non-dualism, which is also very manifest in the text itself, the Tripura Rahasya, which is a work of the Tamil region. And the commentary supports the doctrine with quotations from the works of Vasugupta, Somananda, Utpaladeva, Abhinavagupta, and Kshemaraja. And it's has a very keen sense of the opposition between its own Shaiva non-dualist doctrine and that of the Upanishads, by which it means the Advaita Vedantins of the following the doctrine of Shankaracharya. The work was composed in 1832. The author actually tells us his address. He tells us he was living in the Maha Pushkara, one of the 5 gramas of Madurai, the city of Madurai in the far south in the Pandya, what was the Pandya kingdom. It's a matter of great frustration to me that although he clearly has access to the Tantra Loka and a number of other works in manuscript form at this early date, 1832, long before the availability of an edition of this text, and therefore so it's frustrating to me to know that and not to be able to find any Grantha manuscript, any South Indian manuscript other than one in Kerala, any Grantha-based Tamil region manuscript of the Tantra Loka. Perhaps one is still out there floating around somewhere, but I haven't seen any notice of it. It would be wonderful to have such a manuscript to act as a control, to possibly as a transmitter of superior readings in my attempt to edit the Tantra Loka. Now, I've come to the end of my survey, but I want to end with telling you what this survey does not cover. You know, I'm not pretending to have covered all aspects of the Śākta tradition. There are others which I have not covered here, and which perhaps I'm not fully competent to cover yet because I haven't devoted sufficient attention to them. The first is the very popular cult based upon the Kularnava Tantra. Now, this work is very much cited in later medieval times, and it's a variant of it's a Kaula system which is built upon the Trika with a variant of its mantra known as the Parappara mantra. And this work is really very interesting. It contains a lot of useful material, and it does seem to have been a ritual system that was widely practiced, eventually in Kashmir itself, because East Indians moved into the valley in the late medieval period, bringing with them their own religious traditions. And so we find manuscripts of their texts as well in the manuscript collections of Kashmir. But perhaps the biggest omission is the late Śākta Kaula system, the later Śākta Kaula system of the 10 Mahavidyas that seems to have emerged in Eastern India before spreading throughout the subcontinent. In this, Tripura Sundari retains a central position, but she's joined by such new deities as Dakshina Kali and the Buddhist Vajrayana goddesses, Tara and Chinnamasta. There's no doubt at all that these have come from, these are survivals of the once very vibrant Buddhist tradition of the tantric propitiation of these two goddesses, Tara and Chinnamasta. We can tell that because we can actually see the Buddhist manuals behind the surface of the Śākta ones. Then we have a large body of literature and tradition which could be referred to as smartized Tantrism. That is to say, Tantrism expurgated to be consistent, to be in conformity with smarta, smriti-based notions of what is proper conduct. So in other words, highly expurgated versions of Śāktism and related tantric systems. And the two preeminent works of this tradition are the Sharada Tilaka and the Prapanchasara. And I've spoken at some length about those two texts in my study, Atharva Vedins in Tantric Territory. What these later systems have in common, both the East Indian Mahavidya system, this Paraprasada Kaula tradition, and the Sharika, Tilaka, and Prapanchasara tradition with its heavily expurgated character, what they all have in common is that they lack the distinctive Shaiva doctrinal framework of the early literature, Saidantika and non-Saidantika. So, for example, the distinctive system of 36 tattvas disappears altogether, and rather crudely, Sharada, the Sankhya model of Prakriti and Purusha is superimposed upon the two deities, male and female. So the system is transgressive in the case of the East Indian Mahavidya tradition, and the Parappara tradition, but the distinctive doctrines that we see in the earlier works, both in the scriptures and in their more sophisticated elaboration by authors such as Abhinavagupta, those doctrines are not to be seen here at all. Now, one of the great problems with the study of Indian religion is that we have many texts which give us a great deal of detail on how things should be done, but we have very little means of knowing how widely these prescriptions were followed. How popular were these cults? How influential were they? Were they perhaps freakish fringe phenomena adopted by a tiny minority of people, but simply graced by particularly intelligent spokespersons who produced this vast literature? Or were they in fact really an influential force in Indian religion in these centuries? Well, I end here with evidence of the impact of these Śākta Kaula cults. While we have no demographic evidence that would enable us to say, oh, let's just say 30% of people declaring themselves Hindu at this period, if they were using that term, would claim to be Shaktas or would sign up to the Shakta tradition. While we can't get anywhere near numbers, we can, I think, refute the skeptical hypothesis that these were fringe traditions. And there are three reasons I've cited here at the end of my lecture. The first is the existence of a vast Buddhist literature which is modeled on the Shaiva, the Shakta Shaiva traditions we've been looking at. Texts such as the Hevajra and the Chakrasamvara, or known as Laghu Samvara or Herukabhidana, and others of a similar kind, are not conceivable within Buddhism except as an attempt to utilize the models of worship developed by these Shakta Shaivas and, as it were, to put them to Buddhist work in their relations with the laity of East India. So I don't think that Buddhism would have gone to the extent of developing kind of parallel literature were it not, if it were not the case that these Shakta cults were a major force in the religion of the time. That would certainly apply for East India, and I think also for Kashmir, where these traditions also flourish strongly. Then the second item that I would like to draw your attention to is that the Jains developed their own mantra shastra, their own science of mantras. And we have works such as the Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa and the Jvala Malini Kalpa. And in these works, we see a very strong impact of the cult of Tripura Sundari. These works are modeled on, certainly the Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa particularly, have taken the tradition of the cult of Tripura Sundari and developed their own Jaina versions of these kalpas, these ritual procedures. And this, I think, is a clear indication of the great popularity of this tradition, that the Jains actually, as it were, incorporated it and revised it for their own purposes. And finally, and perhaps this is could claim to be the strongest evidence of all of the popularity of these traditions in this medieval period, and that is the fact that the Smarta tradition assimilated these cults in an expurgated form, these Kaula cults, especially the cult of Tripura Sundari and the Sadanvayas Shambhava. Although not only those, we also see elements of Maharata coming in as well, if we look at the large ritual compendia produced by that tradition. And perhaps, so not only is there a kind of parallel literature which preserves everything of these traditions in a Smarta context, or in a context approved by the Smartas, that is to say, with expurgation of the references to meat, wine, and sexual intercourse. So a kind of expurgated Kaulism was strongly propagated by the Shankaracharyas, who are indeed worshippers of Tripura Sundari. And it's not just that certain pontiffs in positions of authority in South India follow this cult. The devotion to Tripura Sundari is extremely widespread and deeply rooted in the Smarta community of South India. And this can easily be seen by the prominent position of devotion to Tripura Sundari in the Sanskrit and Telugu lyrics of the great composers of the classical Carnatic musical repertoire in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the compositions of Muthuswami Dikshitar, Tyagaraja, and Shyama Shastri. And you can verify this by going online and typing in Muthuswami Dikshitar or Tyagaraja, and you'll see a very strong continuing tradition of devotional singing, which invokes Tripura Sundari, but particularly her Kamakshi manifestation, her manifestation as Lalita or Kamakshi in Kanchi. I think there can be little doubt that this expurgated devotion to the goddess Tripura Sundari is very close to the heart of pious, devout Smarta Brahmins, men and women. Well, I'll draw my exposition to a close here. Thank you for your patience. It's been a rather long lecture. Bye-bye.